workplace. Today, myself and our fantastic panelists will be talking about how to help create change in the workplace, where more than 70% of employees from ethnic minority backgrounds have experienced racism in the last 5 years. Today, we'll be discussing the best ways to educate and engage employees on anti-racism training and workshops, how policies and procedures can better protect and support ethnic minorities at work, and how all employees can deal with incidents they might experience or witness. With social movements such as Black Lives Matter and a shocking increase in cases of xenophobia, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, from microaggressions all the way to outright violence being more prominent than ever in recent times, the call for racism to be stamped out has never been louder. In addition, the number of diversity and inclusion roles has risen exponentially, showing more organisations are investing in and looking to take action to look after their employees from marginalised backgrounds. For those who are new to Culture Shift and our online events, we're a tech for good organisation who believe in a future world of work and study that is safe, happy and supportive for everyone everywhere. Our software and services empower organisations to tackle harassment, bullying and discrimination of all kinds, allowing leaders to activate positive change in their organisations and maintain the culture that they want. Culture Shift software currently helps over 80 organisations better protect their people. It gives over 1.6 million people the opportunity to speak up when they have experienced or witnessed poor behaviour. We help organisations transform the way they listen to their people. We help them foster a sense of belonging that we all desire and seek, and actively help to identify, track, address and proactively prevent incidents of harassment, discrimination and bullying. And in the last 5 years, no customer has ever left us, which is a track record I'm hugely proud of. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Gigi Khonyongwa-Ferndandez, Viv Yau, Bola Gibson and Anarfi. I'm going to take you to the panelists who are going to introduce themselves now. And Bola, I'm going to come to you first.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gemma. Really happy to be here. And I hope everyone enjoyed our little preview on business, which I don't think we realised was being broadcast. But anyway, I'm Bola Gibson. So I'm head of inclusion and corporate responsibility at Osborne Clarke, which is an international legal business, and we're based out of Bristol, Reading and London, and we've got about 1,300 people. So I've been there for about 2 years, and it's been a fascinating 2 years really, when we're thinking not just about race, but actually this kind of very much widening field of diversity and inclusion. So I'm really excited about today.
Thanks, Bola. Rob, I'm going to come to you next.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm Rob Anarfi, or Anarfi, if there are any Ghanaians here. I am Beazley's Chief Risk Officer. Beazley is a specialist insurance company based in the City of London. It's part of Lloyd's of London. My background is as a chartered accountant, done work in the financial services regulator at one point, and various retail insurance companies, Allianz, Aviva and Zurich, and I'm deeply passionate about the subject that we're about to talk about, so thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rob. Viv?
Thanks, Gemma. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here as well. My name is Viv Yau. My day job is I'm the founder of Be Influence. We're an influence marketing agency based in the same office as Culture Shift, actually, where we place diversity at the forefront of everything that we do for clients such as Vista and Greenpeace. In my spare time, I'm also the co-founder of besea.n. We are Britain's East and Southeast Asian network, a non-profit to empower and educate and embrace East and Southeast Asian communities in the UK.
Thanks, Viv. And Geeky? Absolutely last but by no means least, would you like to introduce yourself?
No worries. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Gigi Khonyongwa-Ferndandez, and I'm a professional coach, and my company works a lot with leadership, organizational wellness, and what that looks like. How do you show up? I do lots of work in the maternity and health world, looking at closing the gaps of inequality with healthcare, and race plays a big part in that. I'm quite passionate about that, and so I I'm originally from the other side of the Atlantic, so it's really interesting to see the global discussion around race and racial inequality, and what that looks like. So excited to explore and uncover and actually learn from our time together today.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to come to my first question, which is, what advice would you give to employees who experience or witness racism in the workplace, but don't feel confident or comfortable enough to call it out? You know, there are many barriers to being able to speak up or indeed report something, and that is one of the, you know, it's a huge silencer which can be used sort of as an excuse, I think, for organizations to kind of claim that there is no problem here, so how do we foster that that speak up culture, which is very delicate? Viv, I'll come to you first.
Yes, thank you, Gemma. That is a really great question. First of all, if you're the one who has experienced racism, you're not alone, and how you feel is valid as well. And I'm going to say something that potentially is controversial, but calling it out is not the only solution here. For any Marvel fans out there, I always use the Doctor Strange kind of like looking into the multiverse type of analogy, because I think as a person of color, when you experience something in the workplace, you have to think about all the scenarios that could play out. It can potentially be a really big decision to call it out, because it can leave you feeling ostracized potentially. Your position may become potentially vulnerable within the company, depending on the outcome. So there's lots and lots of scenarios here. And I had this experience where I had realized that it was racism, and I didn't do anything about it for months and sometimes years after an incident has occurred. And I'd realized years afterwards, and it sometimes left me feeling really angry at myself for not speaking up, especially as someone who is Chinese. There is a stereotype that Chinese people are quiet and submissive, and I felt like I was kind of leaning into those stereotypes. But there's also a reason why people choose this route as well. It's an act of self-preservation. There is nothing wrong with taking this route of not feeling comfortable to call it out, because, like I mentioned, this requires so much energy, time, resource, mental strain, on top of just doing your day job. So if you do choose to go down this route, don't feel any guilt or shame for deciding to protect your energy and time. I would say surround yourself with people, things, activities that nourish you outside of work. Speak to trusted friends and family. Sometimes just talking about it and opening up can be really validating. I would say that if you are in a position to deal with this afterwards, firstly, speak to a trusted peer and organise a meeting with either your HR department or someone in the DE&I role, and just with your peer as well. I think having two of you in the room firstly makes you feel more safe, and that whatever you say can be supported and documented by that person as well, and ask them to make sure that they're writing down and documenting absolutely everything in writing during the process in case you need to refer back to it.
Yeah, some really good advice there, definitely. Rob, have you got anything to add to that?
Once I've unmuted myself, I really like that advice from Viv. I think this, for me, I want to move it up to talk about culture, because Viv is absolutely right. Then, you know, we all have different personality types and different life experiences that make us less or more comfortable to speak up in these sorts of situations. But one thing that would be consistent across all types of characters is the culture of an organization. So firstly, I would hope in today's world that most organizations have speak up policies, whistleblowing processes with ideally external independent lines to be used, such that if you're finding it difficult to speak up within the organization, you've got a formal route to use. And one that doesn't have one, and one that creates an atmosphere where it is not okay to speak up, and there might even be real examples of negative impact on colleagues when they have spoken up, points to not the right culture. And I'm also going to say something that might be slightly controversial and maybe easier said than done, which is I think you should then really question whether you're in the right environment. I think most would agree gone are the days where you felt one had to be with just one employer for most of their working life or all of their working life. And I think employers these days understand and acknowledge that it is just as important paying somebody right as it is creating an environment where not just one where they can be themselves from the traditional inclusion and diversity perspective, but one where they can prosper and have peace of mind and have good mental well-being. So if you find yourself in that kind of situation and you're struggling to deal and you can't find somebody external, like Viv said, I think you should really question whether you're even in the right environment for you.
Yeah, definitely. I would definitely agree with that. I think it's sometimes difficult when the options available for people to speak up feel very formal, i.e. going to HR or like whistleblowing, things like that. That sometimes can feel like sort of you're pressing the red button, and it's difficult, so people tend to put up and shut up rather than actually speaking up about it, because the options available to them feel incredibly formal and people don't necessarily want to take those routes. So I think having a mixture of all of those routes plus a culture, like you said, of being able to informally have those conversations is really, really important in order to be able to tackle those and be able to challenge people on their language and behaviours. Bola, have you got anything to add to that?
I think the only thing I'd add to that is kind of almost taking a step back, right? I mean, most of my experiences of racism, in most places, especially in the modern day, are so subtle that often people don't realize that what they've done is racist. So a lot of it is born out of ignorance in particular. It has been my experience. And so I do think that, everything that's been said is absolutely right. The other thing to consider is how your organization helps people understand what it looks like in the first place. And I think this is something that comes up for me all the time. There have been a couple of incidents in my 2 years, and actually the people who have faced it have gone to a safe space. So they've either gone to a colleague who's then come to me, or they've gone to, for example, the diversity network that represents them, and gone and spoken there as well to say, look, I've experienced this, it didn't feel quite right, what do I do about it? And I think it's what was really interesting for me is that when we got permission from the individual who raised it to say, can I talk to the individual who perpetrated this particular incident? And, would you be comfortable if I did that? Because I'd really like to understand where they're coming from. And in all of those cases, those individuals were, one, horrified that they had done something that had made someone feel that way. And they were desperate to understand how they could avoid putting themselves in that position again, because they needed education. And so I do think that there's a finding a safe space, there is a looking after yourself, but there is really thinking about where that's come from and whether or not either you or someone else could help that individual understand that they have crossed that line, because that line, a lot of people have seen that line as something really overt, something really obvious. But actually my experience has been that it's something that is incredibly subtle. It's based on old stereotypes, it's based on banter, it's based on things that people aren't consciously thinking about, stuff that just kind of falls out of their mouth. And one of the things that I try to do is help people be much more conscious of being consciously inclusive, if that makes sense. So
absolutely, being really conscious of inclusion is it's such a good point. I mean, we've talked about there about how employees could speak up about the things that they experience, but it's absolutely vital for us as employers to support people in the workplace. So Gigi, what support would you advise employers provide to ethnic minorities and victims of racism in the workplace to help employers create the space for it to be okay.
How much time do we have? This could be a very long list. But I just want to, I love what Viv and Bola and Robert just said. And I just wanted to quickly say to that we're picking off Bola's point, the awareness that the fact that we all have unconscious bias. And so we all have things that are real that we're coming into. So it's important for us to be on this continual learning pattern that we're checking ourselves at all times. And that's kind of being open to learning. I guess from the employer standpoint, the thing that comes out for me, a few things that comes out is when someone comes to you with something that's happened to them, an experience that's happened to them, a negative experience or racial experience, believe them. The worst thing you could do is downplay or dismiss what they're saying, considering the context, given the fact that the majority of, I think, like you mentioned before, Jim, 70% of people of color have experienced racial harassment. And so their experience with your organization is quite different from your experience if you're not a person of color. So you have to believe their lived experience. And to what Bola said and what Rob and Viv as well, a lot of the negative experiences have not been blatant. Some have, but some have not been blatant. So if you're consistently building up, it's really like trauma, a constant trauma that you're experiencing as an employee, and you're always checking. And the thing with the power of microaggressions is because they're micro, and that's where their power lies. And so the person who's experiencing it are constantly doubting themselves, questions of, did that happen? Did it really happen? Did I really understand that? And so all of the energy and work is on the person experiencing the racism versus the person that's actually doing it. The second thing I would always tell people is to actively listen. And by this, I mean to listen to what's being said and what's not being said. Also listen to hear instead of listening to respond. And that's going to take us to sort of require us to really take a step back and hear what's being said. When there's a shift change, when there's a slight, notice those things that often that tell us a lot more. Those nonverbal things tells a lot more than what's saying verbally. When there's a disconnect, being open to that, and intentionally provide a space of psychological safety. But we say that word a lot, but what that really means is providing a space where people feel safe. I mean, we talked about having safe spaces and whistleblowing and all those, but an organization has to own up to that. And it just can't be something written in writing. People need to feel and see that what we're saying, that we're actually implementing it. And then if we make mistakes, because we're human, we're going to get things wrong, that there's an active way of changing it, that we're really trying to make it better. And I guess the last thing that comes to mind for me is having the heart and bravery to change the status quo. And recognizing that change is a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But I think if employers are really true to their word and what they're wanting to do, that they will be open to putting the work in and putting the heart in, and also that requires them being vulnerable to say, hey, we don't have this right. And what do we need to do to actually get it right? And it may take us a few seconds. And I think people like the authenticity. And they like that, and they like that employers are there and they're there consistently. So that's only 4 or 5, but I have about 100, but we'll stop there.
Yeah. I've got an anecdote from I won't name the retailer, but it's a very well-known British retailer. I was speaking with their ex-chief people officer the other day, who was telling me that they got their response to Black Lives Matter wrong, really wrong. They publicly went on social media, they shared their black square on that Tuesday, and they outwardly shared their commitment to being an anti-racist organisation. However, the moment that was posted on social media, their internal staff email, it was just went off, basically, of the people within their organization who said, you've said this publicly, and we're calling you out because this is not our experience within this organization. And she said that there was interesting reactions from different pockets of the organization. Some were like, let's shut this chat down, let's stop this email from going on so publicly across the organization so that we can handle it, we can handle it privately with these individuals, to no, let's let this play out because we need to hear these voices and then be able to put a plan in place to react to that. And that is what they did. But she was telling me how completely and utterly uncomfortable, to sort of say the least, those few days were for the people that were leading the organization, because it was it was an all-white leadership team who were just completely disconnected from the actual experience of people within the organization, and then they made steps to really address that, and they have worked hard since to continue that, for it not just to be a difficult moment that they all experienced and then everyone sort of forgot about it and move on. But I think it's discomfort and feeling that discomfort and allowing for that to happen, to help as an organization sort of collectively heal, is really important, isn't it? If they'd have shut it down, it would have just literally been the worst thing to have done in the world. So I'm really pleased that that person didn't get their way. Rob, what do you do in your organisation to provide people with support who experience racism in the workplace?
So I think I'm probably gonna keep repeating this word, and I think Rihanna typed in the chat, compassionate leadership is a must. I'm going to take it back up to culture. And can I just say that I think whilst this event and whilst this question is specifically talking about racism towards ethnic minorities, I'm yet to see an organisation that's able to provide support for one underrepresented group and not others. So that says to me that actually this is really about a culture of inclusivity. So I want to start there. So the way I think to create an environment and support for people who are underrepresented is to create a culture where they don't have to feel like they're unrepresented. It's factual that they are, everybody can notice that, but actually being able to very clearly articulate to the whole organization at all times, don't just wait and react when somebody has had an unfortunate experience, what the tolerance levels are and what will and won't be tolerated, because actually that also helps the very first question that we were debating. I think the second thing that comes to mind, which although the question is what do you do to support people from an ethnic minority, it's actually what to do to support the rest of the organization and the leaders themselves, because the lack of awareness, the lack of lived experience is what alienates people. So actually for me, and certainly what we do here, is we try not to make it about the people who are underrepresented. We try and make it about the majority. It's the majority's job to learn and to create an environment where those people feel like they can belong. So what do I mean by that? I mean, and I know we might come to training education later on, Gemma, but it is hard for a leadership team to understand what would make somebody from an underrepresented group or a person from an ethnic minority thrive unless they really understand what their lived experience is, what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I think helping the majority, helping the leadership team understand and not just always focusing on who are the ethnic minorities and what do they need is also something that we do here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Bola, have you got anything to sort of share from things that you've implemented at Osborne Clarke?
Well, I mean, I think just to kind of, affirm what you've just said, Rob, it's that education. So there's one piece which is around, this kind of support is absolutely, the first thing you said, believe them, I think is the very, very first starting point. Really focusing on those kind of safe spaces as well, and making sure they exist. Don't believe that your formal routes are the routes that people are actually comfortable to take, because often a lot of those people who police those formal routes actually haven't been given that training, right? They're just policing those formal routes, and often as a result of that, you will have a negative impact actually on the people who are being affected in the first place. But one of the things that we've done, which kind of speaks to Rob's point, I think, which is around the culture piece and the education piece, is I have found that, you know, the most inclusive leaders are the leaders who have gotten kind of closer to those people who are different from them. You know, some of the most inclusive leaders I know either grew up in very, very diverse environments, or they worked as expats abroad, for example, or someone in their family is somehow then linked to someone who's completely unlike them, or someone in their family turns out to be, for example, identifying as LGBTQ plus, you know, with that identity, and suddenly they're like, oh, I didn't realize that, you know, people were different. And those are the leaders that I've actually found really get inclusion. And so things like reverse mentoring programs, which is something that we've kicked off, has been remarkable, I think, in terms of helping our leaders understand what compassionate leadership means, by giving them that real insight that they're kind of saying, oh, I honestly, I didn't know. I was really, really ignorant. So I do think that focus on that the education of leaders, but also on the broader population, is really critical. And then the last thing that I would say, because I think, and I don't have the statistics, but we do know that actually people who do raise issues of racism in the workplace often don't stay at that workplace. And I think that that's partly because of the lack of support that's given to them through the process. It's to do with the stigma that seems to be attached to the person raising the issue, the person who was the victim of racism, rather than the perpetrators. And I do think a lot of that is around culture, but I think it's also around process, in terms of making sure that that individual is protected and gets the support they need through the process.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting that you raise that piece of research that outlines that people, if they raise something, will generally end up leaving the organisation, and that definitely happens on a regular basis. And what we see as part of our like data analysis through our reporting platform is the reason why many people choose to remain anonymous when they make a disclosure is because they fear the repercussions to their career. The reason why they don't feel that they can say and identify who they are to their organisation is because that they will be branded the troublemaker, and that obviously that is not like a mark that they want against them. They want to raise the issue, for the issue to be tackled in a sensitive way by their organisation, so that they can stay and work and thrive in an organisation that they like enjoy being in. You know, I think those two are, you know, are connected, and I think it's an indictment on the fact that we're not getting this quite right, that people end up leaving an organisation after raising something more often than not. Viv, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that.
I definitely do, Gemma. I think when you were just talking about so many people who have left their jobs for fear of, well, they just can't speak out about it. I mean, I'm going to share a personal experience and what happened to me in a previous role that I was in. And there was lots of factors why I left that role. But when I look back in hindsight, I can see two things were happening. I, from a systemic level, was experiencing racism. So when I look back at most of the people of colour, they were either not promoted or didn't pass their probation, or there was something that stopped them from progressing in the company themselves. And then when we think about everyday subtleties, like Bola and Geeky mentioned about microaggressions, you know, it's death like 1,000 cuts. I can name so many experiences that happened to me in my old role. The joke in that job was that the only way that you could get a job there was to be blonde hair and have blue eyes, and I was the only token Chinese person. And I had people offering me to go to work trips to China to be a translator, even though I don't speak Mandarin, which is the language that is mainly spoken in China. I speak Cantonese, so I would have been useless anyway. And I've had people come up to me and ask me whether that was dim sum that I was having for lunch, even though it wasn't. It was like a Boots meal deal or something really boring like that. And so when I think about the systemic and micro levels of aggression, this came from, again, people of authority above me, meaning that I had no support or confidence that if I raised this, it would actually be firstly acknowledged, and secondly that there would be accountability or any action taken. And I think I really would have benefited from, firstly, well, there not being any racism in the first place, but companies instilling and implementing continual anti-racism and diversity practice that are instilled in every facet of their business. So I really do wonder if my previous employer had undertaken anti-racism courses, so made it something mandatory that when every single person joins the organization, it's something that they have to do, as well as continue to do the work outside. You know, we talked a lot about interpersonal relationships and really humanizing our experiences. I think that's really, really important as well, because if you're stuck within that echo chamber, you're never going to learn. So, you know, there's many, many ways and there's no one solution. But one thing that we've been doing now at Be Influence, we're a really small team of 5. I'm the leader of our organization. But one thing that we found really helpful is we've implemented something called Monday Learnings. And it's just a really casual setting where every day we bring something that we've learned from marginalized groups or stories or popular culture that we've learned over the weekend. And it's really helped broaden our understanding of each other. Most of our team are people of color. We're all women. So these are sometimes things that we've experienced personally as well, but it provides a really safe space for us to learn and validate one another, especially because we don't have the resource of DE&I teams or HR teams. So it's a really great way for us to learn together on this journey.
Yeah, definitely. I bet those are really interesting sessions. We have something similar called shifter sessions. I make sure I have my teeth in when I say shifter sessions to share learning about the people, the diverse range of people who work for Culture Shift in there. I love them. They're one of my favourite things that we do. You mentioned then, Viv, kind of like, you didn't say it in these words, but you kind of can't have like a one-size-fits-all approach and expect that to land well in an organization. So how do you make sure that you're not just kind of taking that like broad brush approach and supporting, like someone's raised kind of intersectionality in the chat? How do you make sure that it's not just like this kind of blanket approach to either anti-racism training or microaggressions training or things like that? How can we do that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question again. And I think, again, yeah, intersectionality is a brilliant way to think about this, because me as a Chinese woman, I'm not going to face the same discriminations as a Chinese man, a Black woman, a South Asian Muslim woman. Even though we all would have experienced racism at some point. I'm going to talk about mainly East and Southeast Asian people. So I'm going to use the acronym EC, so East Asia, so people from Hong Kong, Japan, Korean origin, and Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia origin. I think it's important to think about the issues faced within these communities themselves. So I want to talk about something called the model minority myth, which I don't know whether anyone has heard of before, but this perpetuates the idea that a lot of minorities, and I'm going to talk about specifically East and Southeast Asian people, are seen as hardworking, clever, polite, law-abiding, and that we've achieved a higher level of success than the general population, and therefore do not experience any discrimination or oppression at all. When the reality of this is that it completely just erases our differences and homogenizes our groups within our communities. And all it does is pit East and Southeast Asian communities against other communities of colour in this racial hierarchy. It's for people to buy into the idea that our communities are doing well, and all this does is feed into white supremacy, and inherently feeds into anti-Blackness and anti-brown narrative as well. One fact that I found really stark was that only 0.27% of East and Southeast Asian people are actually in powerful positions in the UK, and that's from the Colour of Power report in 2020. And there are studies that show that also East and Southeast Asian people are viewed as good managers, but not necessarily good leaders. And this starts from a very young age as well. So when we think about East and Southeast Asian children, it can also harm their mental health and behavioural impact as well, for being over-assessed in schools and disregarded in mental health issues. And then moving over to other sectors, when we look at the NHS, a really, really horrible fact, 20% of NHS staff and more than 30% of nurses who died from COVID-19 are Filipinos, which shows that Filipino workers have been singled out, pressured to work in dangerous settings without proper equipment and risk assessments. So these issues within the EC communities are very different within itself. So it's really important to realise and acknowledge these differences and provide tailored care around each of these experiences.
Yeah, definitely. Gigi, I'm going to come to you next with the same question.
Spot on, Viv. I think it's incredibly important that we don't put people in buckets and we don't have this mass stereotype of whatever that is, because oftentimes stereotypes are based off lies, and the truth becomes a lie and lie becomes the truth, and so we can't distinguish between the two. So we're expecting, people to behave in a certain way. And so we're already coming at them with preconceived notions and ideas, and so when they show up in a different way because of our intersectionality, because we are dynamic beings, we try to compartmentalize them. No, you're not supposed to be that way because you are a woman, or you're this, or you're that, and it's ludicrous, but it's something that our systems are based off of. And I think one of the things is making sure that we almost to Rob's point about culture, is that we begin the process of neutralizing. What I mean by that is that all of us have experienced to some degree a feeling of being othered. Mm-hmm. And so if you kind of can begin to tap into that, it no longer becomes, the person of color's issue. It becomes it is a human issue. It is how are we deciding to show up to one another? How are we deciding to really interact with one another and to interface with one another and to protect one another? And so it becomes a much larger issue, a human issue. But it has all these multifacets involved in that. And I think another thing to think about, to avoid this kind of one size fits all, is to understand what we're talking about. I found in my practice that we use this language a lot. We use microaggressions, we use diversity, we use inclusion, we use belonging, equity, whatever. We don't even have a clue often that we were saying the same words, but how it's manifested is different. So I think even taking a step back and having a check about what are we actually saying? What does it actually mean? How is it showing up within our organization? How is it showing up within me individually? And really understanding that, and not be a one-off thing, but something that we're continually doing. And that will help us, for example, to make sure that we're providing equitable practice. And I think it's incredibly important. There's a distinction, between equality and equity. And I remember, this is just a ad hoc, sort of story. My son is blind, and everywhere we go, when we go and we ask for assistance, we're offered a wheelchair. Now he's walking with his cane up, but we're offered a wheelchair because everyone gets the same thing, and that's an example of equality. Equity is really about you getting what you need, and so it's understanding the differences in that. And to Viv's point, her experience would be very different from mine, different from Rob, except different from yours and people here on the audience. And so it's going to take a much more nuanced conversations to be had, to begin to understand that, so that we don't that we avoid, I call it the tick box phenomenon, where we've said, okay, I have X number of whatever, and so therefore I have completed my diversity thing. And it's, we all know that that's could be further from the truth.
Absolutely. I think some of the organizations that we've started working with kind of implemented our software in order to tick a box. And now, because of the power of the software and what it shows up, they can't just take that approach. Basically, like they are faced with you know, the data, but the data are the people within their organization who are sharing their everyday experiences, and they're having to face up to those experiences and understanding like the differences in regions or departments like within the organization, and kind of going, right, okay, well, you know, this like unconscious bias awareness training that we were just going to dish out to like the thousands of people that are working in our organization isn't fit for purpose, because people are experiencing things in different ways, and so we have to listen and tailor our output to what people are to the experiences within the organization. Bola, have you got anything to add to that at all?
I'm not sure that I do, actually. I mean, I think, you know, what's come before has been really, really helpful. I would say that the listening piece is probably the only thing I would emphasize, really, the need to understand the different experiences within an organization and specifically what they are. And actually, I think the reason I really like this question is it does make you kind of stop and think, you know, how much do we do that? And especially over the last, I guess, 2 years, where it has been predominantly about Black people in the UK, I would say. I think in America, there's been more of a focus, I think, on the East Asian and Asian experience. But I think in the UK, it's felt very, very, very focused on the Black population. And I think it might have actually possibly been to the detriment of some of the other minority groups within that broad church. I think, you know, language is obviously important, and I think there's been a definite progress over the last 2 years in terms of disaggregating, you know, from terms like the AME, etc. But, you know, I do think organizations do need to be reminded sometimes that you do need to kind of take a step back, recognize that difference, and make sure that you're creating those spaces for those different voices, because I think it's too easy to to trip on that front.
Definitely. Time is like zipping by really, really quickly, and I can't quite believe we've only got 15 minutes left. I'm going to come to my next question, but I would the chat amongst our listeners is really, really active, so I just want to say, like, thank you for sharing your personal stories and things like that in the chat. It takes bravery and courage to do that, so I really want to thank the people who are tuned in for doing that. And if you've got any questions for the panel, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible. Rob, I'm gonna well, actually no, Bola, I'm gonna come back to you, because this is something that I get a bee in my bonnet about, which is the promise of zero tolerance that is often kind of promised by an organization, but sometimes that can cause real conflict and confusion, because what is zero tolerance to me is different to what is zero tolerance and what can be actioned by the organization sometimes. So what do you think is the best way to approach racist allegations that are made in the workplace?
Goodness. Well, yeah, so this is a massive one. And I think whenever I hear the term zero tolerance, I get really nervous. Now, interestingly, you know, as a firm, we've signed up to charters that talk about zero tolerance, and it's something that we're still working on, because what is it? What do you mean by that? And zero tolerance to what? And do people know what's not tolerated? Do they recognize what's not tolerated? So I personally really struggle with this. In theory, there is no one I've met who kind of says, no, we don't want a zero tolerance workplace. I mean, you know, when it comes to racism, who in their right mind is going to say, no, we shouldn't have zero tolerance, right? But I think we have real challenges in terms of defining what that means. So, for example, if I raise those two issues these two instances over the last 2 years where people have come to me with essentially a real sense that they've been, not necessarily, they wouldn't class themselves as a victim of racism, but they've been in a place where they have witnessed something that could be classed as racism in the workplace. Now, under a zero tolerance policy, depending on how you define it, in theory, I could be firing the individual that they identified as, saying something that they believe to be racist.
Mm-hmm.
But is that the kind of organization that we want to be working in? That's one question, I think, which is around culture. Does that person realize that they're being racist? Do they understand what the boundaries are that we've set around race and racism? So you kind of have to go back if you're looking at this kind of policy, which is something that we are looking at, trying to define. We haven't done it yet because I think it's really, really complicated. But in terms of where we hope to get to, the first is education. So we have to set standards within the organization. We have to educate people so that they understand what is and isn't acceptable. After that, we can then start talking about those boundaries. So how do you set the boundaries? So what happens if something happens the first time? Actually, it might be that something happens the first time and someone needs to either attend some training or be educated in some way that helps them understand that they have crossed the line if you have not done that in the first place. Another kind of real example that I've come across, where someone was hiring someone into a team, and they were openly talking about one candidate who had immigrated to the UK, so they'd come from abroad, and they were talking about whether or not this person's English would be up to the job, right? And actively talking about where they came from and whether or not they've actually got those kind of language skills to be able to deal with it, because there's a lot of talking to clients in this role. And someone in HR kind of rightly flagged that as that's not the criteria that you have for this role. That is not what you should be judging these candidates on. You should be judging them against their skills, etc. Now, in theory, you could have gone to that person to say, what you've done is potentially illegal. We've got zero tolerance and you're fired. I think, when you see these examples, you kind of look and go, well, no, none of those examples to me feel like a fireable offense. So then you have to go back to say, okay, well, what do we mean by zero tolerance? And what is the process that we would follow and be really clear about and educate our people about, so that they are ready and understand what it is we're talking about. So it's a really long-winded answer, actually, but it is a complicated question.
It's a really, really complicated question.
It's a really complicated question.
And I think zero tolerance means like zero tolerance, right? So to all of the things that you've raised, that maybe they don't sound like a sackable offence, but that if someone had come to you and said, this happened to me and I want there to be sanctions, this is the zero tolerance organization, therefore those are the sanctions, like that they should lose their job. And that's why I'm saying it's like a false promise that you're giving to your people, because it can't be zero. Well, you have to define it, I think, though, Gemma, right? So for me, it might be that you say, we do have a zero tolerance, but we recognize that we're an organization of human beings, right? So people are going to make mistakes. Some of them are going to be genuine, obviously, and some of them, I suspect, there will be those, probably a relatively small handful in my own personal experience, which are deliberate, right? Mm-hmm. So this is how, as an organization, we're going to deal with that. We will give you the tools to understand the difference between the two. If after being given the tools, you are still repeatedly, whether that's 1, 2, 3, breaching those kind of agreed boundaries, then there will be consequences. But I do think that there has to be, so yes, there has to be sanctions, but there also has to be clarity, I think, for people. Because every time I have a conversation with someone around what's happened, the individual that I've raised it with has realized that they are completely ignorant, right? And you can't sanction someone who's ignorant. You have to educate them. And so I always kind of think that we need to remember that we're dealing with human beings and not machines.
but you have to put a process in place whereby, you know, there are boundaries around those, these kinds of things. So yeah, it's not as easy as a zero tolerance. Yeah, great, zero tolerance policy, and then it's like, how do we define this thing?
Yeah. And I will move on to one of our audience questions and the other panelists here, but someone sent me a poster that was in an A&E waiting room the other day, which was, the top of it said, "We take a zero tolerance approach to racial harassment towards our staff," and then listed 6 things that they would do. The 6th one was that they would remove care of the individual that was racially harassing staff. But to me, that's not zero tolerance. We will tolerate it up to 6 times, basically, and then we will remove care. And I know that it's very difficult for the NHS to say that they're not treating someone. I know that is a very difficult thing to do, but like, that's not zero tolerance. That's whatever, 6 tolerance, you know what I mean? So we will tolerate it 6 times before we take action. Okay, I'm going to move on to some audience questions. Someone has asked, how do you manage or tackle barriers in organisations who have a very white demographic and are based in a very white area, who feel that they don't need anti-racism work or training? As Chief Risk Officer, Rob, I'm going to come to you first.
Problem, Gemma. That's a tough question, and it brings me to probably something I'm not sure we've picked up yet, because everything we've been talking about, to an extent, we've talked about culture a bit. We've almost isolated them to this particular item of inclusion and diversity, and actually, I think it was Gigi that said earlier on, we need to remember why we're doing this. And I always say we're doing this for diversity of thought, right? It's not purely just from a fairness perspective. I work in a commercial environment, and one of the reasons why some organizations find that this doesn't really take hold, or you know, George Floyd gets murdered and there's a lot of activity and a lot of noise for a year and then it all dies off, is because it hasn't been inculcated into the organization's reason for being. Leaders don't really seem to understand the link between resolving this issue and achieving their commercial imperatives. So that question sounds like there's an organization or a group of people who don't really understand the value or the importance of diversity. And so I would start there, because if people fundamentally don't understand why a group needs to be more diverse, if people are sports people, football, I often say, why would you have a football team of 11 goalkeepers? Or, you know, you can give various analogies that may bring the message home. So I think we often rush to the solutions and wonder why they feel like a bit projecty, and they're a tag on, they're an add-on, and then we tick a box, we move on, and then we find things haven't really been inculcated. And so for me, it's just really going back to basics of before suggesting or insisting that people need training. You have to ask whether people understand the value or the importance of having diversity in their workforce, and, you know, representing the clients they're serving or the suppliers they have, etc. And if they understand that, I think you've got a better chance of them understanding, okay, if you understand the value of it and you understand we're not there yet, here are some steps that we can take to help us create that. And that includes enhancing your awareness, giving you some training if you don't have lived experience. I think if you jump straight to the solutions, people might feel forced into it. They may even come along, but it will be short-lived, and you won't actually achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, like, the longevity and that, you know, and embedding it into the organization is like so important, rather than kind of flash in the pan things that organizations do because it's Pride Month or because it's Black History Month. Let's talk about it in this month, rather than having a constant conversation that really speaks to all of the individuals within an organisation. Definitely. Geeky, have you got anything to add to that at all?
I was just going to say, just that query just strikes me as feeds into the importance of understanding really what diversity is. And so if you've just kind of, even within your own team, it's like where I was like, if you understand, even if you have a group of predominantly white people, they're not all the same. You know, they don't have the same interests. So diversity can mean diversity of thought. So, you know, it could be urban versus rural. It could be a number of things. And I think widening up that discussion about what are we actually saying and what diversity actually means for us. And it will look differently than what, you know, someone maybe that's in a more ethnically diverse area. But I think that goes back to my point earlier about making sure making it more neutral and realizing that we all have experienced some degree of otherness, and it may be defined as something differently, but we have to understand that we can't put, even if everyone looks the same, they're not the same. And we can't put them in that same box. And there's a real danger when we do that, because we, it's like a false sense of security and a false sense of protection, and a false sense of we're okay. When you may not be. So it is about beginning to microscopically examine that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. One question before we go, and like it's going to have to be a very quick answer, I think. How can a workplace actively and effectively hire from more minority groups? And the NOC who's asked this question says that their team is currently 90% white. They're not getting the applicants, so how can they change this? Has anyone got any advice?
Well, there are a couple of things. So we've just gone through a process. One of the things that we've done is really look at how we design our job descriptions actually and roles. And you know, a lot of people talk about language, but it's also about boiling it down to what you're actually looking for. And we've had a number of managers really struggle with this, because you know, we tend to put a lot of gumph in our role profiles and descriptions, and actually all that gumph does is it tends to help people rule themselves out. So what you really need to do is really strip it away and think about exactly what it is specifically you're recruiting for. This is regardless of whether you're going to put it on a specific, you know, site that targets ethnic minorities or other people with diverse characteristics. You know, really kind of boil down to your essential, what specifically am I asking someone to do in this job? And I think if you can be much more precise about that, fewer people will rule themselves out. And that's kind of one of the things that we're starting to find.
I'll very quickly add, Gemma, if I may. We've tried lots of things. Two things that I'd share that have been evidently most impactful: really challenging which suppliers we use for recruitment, and we read them the Riot Act. You bring us a diverse group of candidates, or if you've got one opportunity, you don't, you're out the door. Simple. Second, what's had a perhaps naively unexpected impact is making sure that our leadership teams are diverse. That has been so powerful. We haven't even had to go and look. And the numbers of people who've said, well, I joined because I saw you had a female CFO. I mean, in our market, it's not very diverse at all in every regard. And it just seems to that because there are people who believe they can't be what they can't see. And seeing that people are thriving and are developing and are being recruited into senior positions in organizations seems to really bring other diverse talent along. So I thought I'd share those two.
Yeah, definitely. And Viv, I don't want to speak for you, but I think the point that you've raised in the chat is really important about how you are really explicit within the job spec that you champion diversity, and really making that explicit in your job descriptions when you're recruiting for talent. Okay. We've come to the end of our time, which is gone too quickly, I'm afraid. But I just want to start by thanking my panelists who've joined us today so much for joining us and for adding to a really interesting and insightful discussion. I want to thank everyone that tuned in and listened. We will be sharing the recording of this later today. So please feel free to pass it on to anyone who you think would benefit from hearing the conversation. We will also be continuing to do these culture shift webinars webinars and sessions. So please look out for any future sessions that are coming up. Thanks very much for joining us, and I hope everyone has great days and great weeks.